Stories of Healing. Little Eyes by Lillian Alnev. The simple act of saying I have a long memory of traumatic experiences still makes me shrink with shame. There's a physical list on paper, and that shames me too. It is too long and gruesome to seem true, yet at the same time everything on it feels trivial. I've been told that's survivor's guilt. I may work forever at dropping the comparing and judging of myself. Some of my perpetrators could have been prosecuted as felons had they been exposed. I've witnessed many of the same indignities committed against others. But the most heartbreaking event of my childhood is materially quite small. It's also the best example I have that I'm beginning to heal. The neighborhood I grew up in was ragged. Everything that was exposed quickly rusted. But the Great Lakes Basin was beautiful in all her seasons, and the extremes in weather made every yard a natural art box full of wood, rock, pigments, and ornaments for a child who loved to make things. I spent all of my free time outside building a miniature settlement where there were no schools, no liquor stores, churches, or jails. I built a utopia where none of my tormentors were welcome. I made stick houses with grass thatch and stone houses with bark shingles. I graded roads in the glacial till, dammed rainwater to form a lake and canals. House by building, a town grew. There was a farm sown with gigantic radishes and carrots, the seeds pinched from the family garden. My favorite toy farm animals and dinosaurs moved into the houses and made it a community. As I worked around the seasons on my tiny civil engineering project, I developed the sensory illusion of seeing the entire world from the height of about 10 inches. My little eyes delighted, and I felt protected me. One winter Sunday morning I awoke and dressed early, excited to see my town covered in a new snowfall. When I came around the juniper windbreak sheltering our back door, I saw a single set of small, dark shoe prints in the snow pointing from the front gate toward my village. Hard-soled shoes had made the footprints, not the tire-tread rubber galoshes we all wore in the winter. My first thought was how much trouble someone would be in for wearing school shoes in the snow. The implication of the trail hit me a moment later. I have the memory that there was no exit track. The visitor and my village and animals seemed to have floated away into the air. I ran back to the house screaming, and actually accused my father of destroying my little world as some kind of bizarre punishment. What had actually happened is still incomprehensible. I had experienced other violence and cruelty, but no one had yet literally stolen from me. Someone had taken my animals, my work, and with it my little eyes. I began to distrust the land. My art became awkward and infrequent. I'm fortunate to be alive. I'm grateful to have a spiritual practice. I can meditate in community because the exhortation to kill the Buddha should I meet him on the road comforts me, reminds me that questioning appearances is essential to my survival. When my Sangha mates organized a retreat for people who had suffered trauma or abuse as children and called it Healing the Inner Child, my extreme inner critic fumed. The inner helper industry, my inner thin person, my inner genius, my inner French chef, activates my scathing inner insurgent. In truth, I was very scared. But I signed up for the retreat anyway, and participated in the exercises. I even managed to start writing the letter to my younger self. "Hey, kid, I know you don't like your name, so what should I call you anyway?" it began. I wrote for a long time, but I wasn't far into it before I noticed the voice change. The kid was writing to me. At first I just cried. Then I listened. Eventually I went outside and did what she asked me to do. At the edge of the stream I picked up rocks that were smooth and cool. They felt good in my hands. I started to arrange them on the sand. Some time later the bell calling us to dinner interrupted my concentration. I wiped the grit from my hands and stood to look at what I'd made. A small stone table held 2 stone plates, piled with seeds from a plant on the bank. 2 stone chairs sat by the sides of the table. The seating had a great view of the water. Early the next morning I walked back down to the stream. The small dining scene was still there, and in the damp sand I could see the footprints of deer, birds, and several small mammals that had all walked carefully around the table. The seeds were gone. Later that afternoon I returned again. The cold water had changed course, and the entire grey bank was new, smooth, and empty. This time I knew nothing could be stolen from me. As I walked away toward the zendo, I noticed that up to about a foot off the ground I could see with vivid definition. I finally began to experience the grief. My little eyes were back. What Can I Do to Help? By Joanne Friday. My mother had been very, very sick for almost a year, and during that time she'd been hospitalized 8 times. In between hospitalizations, she'd been sent to a skilled care nursing facility. I was at one of these places with my father visiting her. My father is a World War II veteran who has been very successful at controlling his environment and creating conditions where nothing bad happens. He's an extremely meticulous person, and having things in order is very important to him. He'd always done a good job of taking care of things, and he did a wonderful job of taking care of my mother. But now she was dying, and there was no way to control that. So it was extremely difficult for him. When things are out of control, he tries harder to control them, and he gets impatient, irritated, and angry. That is just his habit energy. We were sitting in the nursing home, and he was getting irritated and angry with my mother. He became very impatient with her. I was sitting there, and I could just feel the rage coming up in me. My habit in the past would be to tell him, "Cut it out, she can't help it." Instead, I stopped and breathed, and I knew I needed to get out of that room. If I were to say or do anything, I knew it would only cause more suffering for myself and my family. So I said, "I'm going to go for a walk." I went out into the parking lot of the nursing home and did walking meditation. I got in touch with my breathing, and after a few minutes I got myself calmed down, and then I invited that rage up in me. I breathed with it and looked deeply in order to understand it. The feeling took me back to my past. What I understood was that my strong response to my father was really about my being 3 years old and having my father use that same anger with me, that same impatience. And it was that badly hurt 3-year-old who was having such a powerful reaction in the present. I took good care of that 3-year-old. I hugged her and told her what she needed to hear. I told her that her father's impatience and anger had nothing to do with her. I told her that since she was only 3 years old, there was no way she would know not to take it personally, but that in fact it only had to do with her father's unhappiness. He would have treated anyone else the same way. It was not about her. After I understood, I felt nothing but compassion for myself and for my father. It was a direct experience of what Thai teaches us. Mindfulness leads to concentration. Concentration leads to insight. Insight leads to understanding. Understanding leads to compassion. Different people have different responses to this practice. Most of us have been running away from the feelings that scare us for our whole lives. Just by stopping and breathing and embracing the feeling in us, we have begun the process of transformation and are expanding our capacity for fearlessness. In my case, the anger led me to myself as a 3-year-old who was experiencing the same feeling that I was experiencing in the present. When I felt that happen, I knew that something had been transformed. I knew that I was fine to go back into the room with my mother and father. When I'd left the room, I'd been viewing him as an ogre, but when I re-entered my mother's room, I took one look at my father, and all I could see then was his suffering. It was so intense that it was almost too much to bear. I could see how afraid he was. And then all that I felt for him was compassion. There was nothing but compassion, and the only thing to say was, "I am so sorry you are having to go through this. What can I do to help?" What was clear to me was that as long as I was stuck in my own suffering, I couldn't see anybody else's. It was impossible for me to have clarity. All I could see was my own suffering. Had I not taken care of my own strong emotions, I would have felt perfectly self-righteous. I would have told myself that I was just being a good daughter, that all I cared about was my mother. I would have believed that I was just trying to take good care of her, and my way of doing that would have been to tell my father to cut it out. If I'd done that, it would have been my father alive in me, reacting by criticizing and judging. He may have felt more judged and criticized, and may have treated my mother even worse. I would have created exactly the situation that I was trying to prevent. I've been practicing long enough to know the right words to say and how to say them. I could have stopped myself from criticizing him when I was there to begin with, without my having to go outside. But I might still have been feeling enraged, and if I'd said those same words without having first gone outside, I might have said them in such a way that my father would have felt judged and criticized by my tone of voice, the expression on my face, or my body language. So I have discovered that mindful speech isn't just choosing the right words to say. It's transforming the ill will in my heart. When I look deeply and come to a place of understanding in myself, I feel only compassion for myself and the person with whom I'm having the problem. When the suffering in my heart has been transformed, I feel only understanding and love for both of us. Then it doesn't matter so much what words I choose. The person only feels love. People know when they are loved, and they know when they are not. I have found that the more I use this practice, although I still experience all of the strong emotions, the more the intensity of the difficult emotion lessens in me. I can say, "Hello, anger, my little friend. You're back again." Then the intensity is gone. When I take good care of the wounded child in me, the feeling may still be there, but my relationship with it has been transformed, and my perceptions of the world and of relationships with others have been transformed as well. The miracle of mindfulness happens. The Real Me by Glen Schneider. One afternoon I was thinking about an important friendship that had exploded and failed, and the hurt I felt, and I was wondering about calling this person again, to try to see if there was an openness to sort things out and reconcile. As I was mentally rehearsing what she might say and how I would respond, I noticed this awful knot in my stomach, a rejection-type knot. And I thought, well, it's afternoon, I have some time, and no one else is home. Why don't I just investigate this energy? I sat on the couch and just focused my mind on this knot in the area of my stomach, and soon I started to hear in the back left corner of my head a clear, sharp slap, slap, slap sound. I knew right away that was the sound of my father's belt hitting my bare bottom when I was about 6 years old. I could really feel the hits, and for a long time I just exploded with crying and wailing and pleading. I was reliving this beating, with my mother standing there in the kitchen watching him. She had put him up to it, and the little me was begging, "Please don't hit me, I'll be good." Sitting on the couch, I wondered if I was having a psychotic episode, but it also felt very healing, and I let the energy come up and out. As I began to calm down, there appeared in my mind a dark tunnel that pulled me in. I got very scared, and I thought, oh boy, now I'm going to discover some abuse that I don't remember. But I decided to enter it anyway. And the moment I did, I was a little boy back in our chicken house, and I was putting my hand under a chicken sitting on the nest, feeling her warm, soft feathers and the smooth, warm eggs underneath. When I was a child, my family lived in the country, and we had about 50 chickens. We sold eggs, and I helped to take care of the hens. Having my hand there under the chicken was one of the most wonderful, wholesome, life-affirming feelings I'd ever had. I was looking around and seeing the sharp, crisp edges of the oyster shells we fed the chickens, and all the details of the door we closed every night to keep the raccoons and foxes out. And then outside in the orchard, there was the bright yellow mustard blooming. For about 10 minutes, I had this reverie, like being in heaven. of all the delightful, wonderful sights and smells of my childhood. The colors were so bright, and the shapes were crisp, and I was awestruck. Eventually that moment ended, and my younger self was walking back on the path toward our house, and a voice came into my head and said, "They put that in you." With the help of a Sangha sister who works with troubled, incarcerated youth, I began to understand that "they put that in you" meant that others put the trauma in me, the bad things that happened, but it was not the real me. The real me was the boy who loved the sights and colors and shapes I grew up with. The awful energy that had been put in me had shut away from my memory, like an iron door, some of the wonderful parts of my growing up. I feel lucky to have gotten that trauma energy out of myself. I wish I could say I released all of that pain in one sitting, but I can't. It took a number of visits, but each time the charge was much less, and at the end it felt kind of like doing the household chores. Oh, time to clean again. With time and diligence, it is all smoothed out. I think the part of us that gets wounded is the part that can love. That is our goodness. Although it can get hidden under the suffering and pain, there is still within us the part that can embrace and delight in the precious beauty and tenderness of this world, and care about it, and share it open-heartedly. That has been my experience. Sitting with a Friend by Elmar Vogt. I was in Plum Village for the retreat in June of 2006, and I was very sick for nearly the whole 3 weeks. I spent much of my time lying in bed with a strong pain in my stomach. I had terrible diarrhea and was not eating much, but people around me, the monks, the lay friends, and my roommates, they were trying their best to help me. One roommate and I really connected. He had brought his concertina, which is like a mini accordion with buttons, and early on we discovered our shared love of singing. He was sitting in the fields playing and singing American folk songs. I came closer and we started to sing harmonies together in the evening sunlight. Since that day, whenever we found the time, we were singing together. We began to bond and trust each other, and we just became friends. On the morning of one of the last days, I was still in bed when my roommate came back from breakfast. He sat down on the edge of my bed and asked how I was feeling. And then he asked if I would like to explore this terrible feeling in my stomach in meditation. I said yes. So he started by singing a couple of songs for me, and then he rang the bell and suggested that I just focus on that feeling in my stomach, let go of all the thinking, and be open for whatever wants to come up. So after a minute or so, I was a little boy again. I was hiding in our basement, behind where we kept the coal. I was shouting at my grandmother to get out of the house. My grandmother lived with my family my whole life, since before I was born, ever since her husband, the grandfather I never knew, went missing in action during the Battle of Stalingrad on the Eastern Front in 1942-43. When I was a child, I experienced a kind of poisonous tension because of her presence in our home. Then in meditation, my little child was asking my father to take me away from there. After a minute or two of this, I felt a tear coming down from the corner of my eye, and my roommate must have noticed, because he reached out and started to stroke my forearm and said, "It's okay. Just let the feelings come out." I just broke down and cried and sobbed for a very long time, perhaps 20 minutes. It felt very healing. When I calmed down, my stomach felt a lot better. Then we talked and talked about my growing up, my parents, and our daughters, as we both have daughters in their mid-20s. We had lunch together, and I taught him a German folk song, Bunt sind schon die Wälder, about the colors of the leaves in the fields in the fall. I still experience this tension in my stomach, but it is different than before that meditation. I experience it as the despair of the little boy in my mother's womb not feeling safe again. And I can see my father in me, who was given away to his aunt when he was only 2 years old. He never knew the reason, and he never had a real home. My mother lost her father when she was very young and could not even cry because her father was missing. No one knew if he would come back. and my grandmother had to work very hard to get by herself, and support her 2 children. She loved her husband very much, but he didn't come back. And her husband, like my father, didn't grow up with his parents. My grandmother shared one time with me that her husband said to her, "I only know what home is since the time we've been married and lived together." What a pity that he never came back. So looking back, I see that during that time in Plum Village, the dam was breaking. Now I can still feel some pain and tension in my stomach, and I realize that it is not only me. It is many generations of my family, and it is also our history as the German people. Perhaps it is too much to be transformed in one lifetime. What I try to do now is to be in contact with my little boy inside, listen to him, speak to him, and invite him to come into the present moment and show him the wonders of life.